Welcome everyone to the Common Good Project's conversation series on what is the common good. My name is Ryan Mead and I'm the convener of this series, and I'm joined today by my co-convener, Chris Conway. We'll dispense with our biographies that are on our website so that we can get to our guest scholar. Our guest scholar today is Nigel Biggar, and we're very excited to have him here to discuss the question of what is the common good. I want to first thank the Faculty of Law, as well as Blackfriars and the Aquinas Institute for co-hosting the event. And also to remind listeners that our conversation series explores the question of what is the common good in the context of law and society. And we've been using Thomas Aquinas' definition of law as an ordinance of reason for the common good promulgated by the one who has care of the community, and exploring that question of what is the common good, but also many of the various tributary ideas that flow into the dynamic notion of the common good. As far as format goes, as usual, if you've been following along in this course, Chris will introduce our guest scholar today, and then I will have a series of opening questions for Professor Biggar to answer, and then Chris and I will engage in conversation with our guest, and we will leave about 10 minutes at the end of the hour for questions. Please put your questions in the chat box and we'll monitor them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. If we can't get to all of them, we will use the questions for future programming. So please don't hesitate to put the questions in the question box. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris for introductions.
Today, as we said, our guest scholar is Nigel Biggar, who is a Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford. Professor Biggar has had a distinguished academic career in theology and ethics. He was a fellow of Oriel College until moving to the University of Leeds in 1999. To serve as chair of theology. In 2004, he became chair of theology and ethics at Trinity College, Dublin, before returning to Oxford in 2007 upon his appointment by the Queen as Regius Professor of Theology. He is a canon of Christ Church Cathedral. Professor Biggar is also the director of the MacDonald Center for Theology, Ethics, and Public Life, which is a highly active research institute at Oxford. Professor Biggar is a prolific author of books, articles, and essays. His academic interests range widely, including being one of the world's leading scholars of just war theory, as well as holding a prominent role in medical ethics. His works on national identity and loyalty have fostered considerable discussion. His book is What's Wrong with Rights? And note that the title is a question and not an affirmative statement. One of his first significant publications in jurisprudence was co-editing a 2000 collection of essays entitled The Revival of Natural Law, Philosophical, Theological, and Ethical Responses to the Finis Grise School. Professor Biggar read history at Worcester College, Oxford, where he received a BA. He received a Master's of Christian Studies from Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia. He then studied at the University of Chicago, where he was awarded a PhD. Welcome, Professor Biggar.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So to start with, perhaps before discussing the common good head on, it may be best to discuss important distinctions in your social theory, because my sense is that there will be used as building blocks for the thoughts as we get to the common good. In your most recent book, What's Wrong with Rights, you assert that there are no natural rights, as I understand it, but you make important distinctions between positive legal rights, so-called natural rights, and natural morality. Could you briefly explain these distinctions, as well as any other categories of rights that you want to discuss?
Yes. On the one hand, we have moral claims. I may have a moral claim against you for some kind of right treatment. I think of a right as being an especially strong, cogent moral claim. And the question is, what is it that makes the claim stronger than usual? And the answer, I think, is that a right has the support of an array of social institutions, the normative authority of law, the enforcement by police and by courts. So I think of a right as being a positive legal phenomenon that depends on social institutions. So that's what I think of as a right. It is paradigmatically, primarily, basically legal. Now, a natural right is supposed to be a right that exists where there are no social institutions. So in a state of nature, which could be, there aren't many places nowadays, there are not many new worlds that have not been trampled over. But if there are any, then where there is no law, no positive law, then it might be supposed that natural rights exist there. Or in a state where all social institutions have collapsed, institutions of law, courts have collapsed, and there is no effective enforcement of law, you might say, well, nevertheless, natural rights still obtain. And also at the international level, between peoples, if there are no formal legal treaties, then you might say that natural rights still obtain. However, in my view, because the concept of a right really depends on the existence of social institutions, there can be no such things as natural rights outside of a society. That's not to say that there aren't natural moral claims. They just don't have the force of rights. So there we have legal rights and we have natural rights. Then third, there's this category of human rights. And as I understand them, human rights can mean two different things. They can mean rights that are supposed to derive from human nature and that exist wherever human beings are, even in a state of nature. In other words, human rights there are equivalent to natural rights, and I don't think they exist. So I put those aside. However, since 1948, at least, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have had a body of rights that states have subscribed to. That makes them international law. And insofar as those rights are then enforced by courts like the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, then they become even more strongly law. So human rights in no sense, in the sense of international legal rights, yes, I think those exist and are important. So those are the main distinctions.
No, thank you. And that's those are very good descriptions of the distinctions that you discuss in the book. And just to emphasize something, because I think some readers of the book have glossed over an aspect of what is fairly foundational, and is that although you're saying there are no natural rights, you're not saying that there is no natural law. As I read the book, that there is no right in a state of nature, as you described, because you can't have a right without being pre-social. Even if one were to go to the right duty corollary, it needs other people. You need to be in society with people. With this extent, you're not denying the importance that rights play in justice if the natural morality or the natural law is still in play in how the state enacts laws, treats people, is forming positive rights, and that the positive rights would need to conform, perhaps, I don't know if that's too strong of a statement, need to conform to natural law or natural morality.
Yes, that's correct. I would just, my quibble would be that the phrase natural law could, in this context, be slightly misleading, in that if we're talking about law, then of course rights are a legal phenomenon. I would rather talk about natural morality. I'm a Christian. I'm bound, I think, therefore, to believe that there are natural, objective, universal moral principles, although, as Thomas Aquinas well said, when these are refracted in particular cultural and other circumstances, they can differ among themselves in terms of their specifications, but there are universal moral principles. There is what I would call natural morality. And natural morality may well, depending on circumstances, justify or oblige the creation of legal rights. So positive legal rights can be justified by natural morality. And in the absence of rights against, let's say, an overweening state or an overweening pope, as some felt in the medieval period, one can appeal to natural morality and say, well, there should be some legal protections against overweening interference. So by preferring not to talk of natural rights, I mean, there are ways in which one could talk about natural rights. I just think they're misleading. So I prefer not to talk about them. But even in the absence of natural rights talk, I still think there is a higher moral authority which can both justify the behavior of states and the laws of states and the rights that laws grant, and act as a foundation for critique of them.
And so in your book, you have a wonderful comment in your introduction asking the reader to have patience while you review the intellectual history of rights before you get up to your theory. So in some ways, I think that's what we've been doing the past few minutes, is laying a groundwork. So now with that foundation of your views on rights in mind, how does this framework say something about the common good, or your view of the common good in light of these ideas?
Yeah. Well, some people are inclined to think, and I think some Christians are inclined to think that rights vie against common good, that rights are inexorably conceived in a very individualistic fashion. And I don't think that. If I have a legal right, then you have a legal duty. So in a sense, rights and duties are reciprocal. And what that means is that the legal right requires you to treat me in a certain way. Let's suppose the right is justified, then it requires you to treat me justly. And what that means, therefore, is that if these rights are indeed properly effective and well supported by social institutions, then that creates a social ethos where, at least through fear of legal sanctions, people treat each other well, and a general social ethos where we can assume that other people will treat us well enables us to trust people, and trust allows all sorts of things to flourish. So rights can actually enhance the common good we all enjoy. However, I don't think that rights are sufficient, because, as I suggested, rights as legal phenomena have force because of the threat of legal sanction if they're violated. Well, that's good, but it's kind of negative and basic. Much better if we have a citizenry who treat each other well, not simply because they fear punishment, but also because they have been trained in virtue. And so in a sense, the threat of legal punishment recedes. It's no longer relevant because people do what they should anyway. Now, of course, we know in actual societies, not everyone does as they should, so we do need law. But much better if we can have a virtuous citizenry. So rights are, they're not necessarily opposed to the common good. They can actually help to foster it, but we need more than rights. We need common good. We also need virtue. We need and there are also some duties that rights don't oblige, but that impose themselves on the right holder. So we certainly need a richer moral discourse than rights simply.
And we'll get a bit into duty in just a few minutes, but one thought that comes to mind as you were speaking is that natural rights, if we were to talk about them, or if we were to talk about natural morality requiring the state to do something and enact positive law, one of the things that positive law does is that it provides limiting principles to rights. So it's always struck me that one of the challenges of rights talk is, aside from not mentioning duty, is that it often doesn't have limiting principles. So it's very hard sometimes to operationalize. And if we were to think that law is a teacher, then it can also be very difficult to figure out how and what it is teaching if we don't know the contours and the limits. But perhaps it can just become reduced to a slogan without positive law. But with that, Chris, you have some questions.
Yes, I do. How do you see the role of the state in promoting the common good? Is the state the principal actor responsible for promoting the common good, or are there non-state actors in small societies that are equally involved in promoting the common good?
Yeah, that's a really important question. First of all, just a reflection on the concept of the common good, because again, as a Christian, I'm naturally inclined to believe in the common good. I believe in individuality too, but I'm not radically individualist. We all depend on other people, dead or alive. But often when I've read about the common good, I have struggled, as it were, to get a firm grip on what exactly we're talking about here. And it could connote some kind of unitary thing that the state imposes in some fashion. I suppose if you believed in utilitarian calculations, then maybe there's some mega utilitarian calculation that could figure out what the common good is, and people up there in the state who do the calculation then decide to roll it out on top of the rest of us. Well, I don't actually believe in utilitarian calculations of that kind, so I don't think it's possible, but you can imagine some states that might think that that's possible, perhaps communist ones. Well, in that case, the common good is generated by the state, and I would not welcome it. So let's put that aside for the moment. I don't think the common good makes sense in those terms for reasons I've just explained. But here's another way of looking at it. One common good, and I think it's better to think of common goods, frankly, not the common good. There are many common goods that we all benefit from, we all contribute to, but no one of us owns them. That's, I think, what a common good is. So social peace in the streets, lack of violence is something we all benefit from. And that's the basic function and benefit of a state. So, you know, I get the fact that individual freedom is important, but when the homesteader is under attack by bandits, most homesteaders would welcome the arrival of the 7th Cavalry. Well, the 7th Cavalry is the state. So even though we might worry about the state being overweening, and in Western history, of course, that's been a major problem, how to limit the state. But reflection on history, our own history, even in Britain in the 15th century or in the 17th century, will remind us that sometimes a major problem is a state that is too weak or too absent. Yeah. So I think the state is certainly important for maintaining the good of social peace, and one of the ways in which it does that is through upholding rights.
One point that has struck me about your view of natural rights are your remarks about confusing the notion of a natural right with something being morally right or morally good. Your argument seems to answer one of the strongest critiques against positivism, and the critique goes a little bit something like this, that if there are no natural rights, the state sets out its choosing of positive rights and positive duties, which can be a small number or a large number, but those rights are dependent upon the state, which can take them away at will. Your argument seems to answer this by acknowledging that the comings and goings of rights by the state is the case if the state is not tied to natural rights. Nevertheless, the state has no jurisdiction over what is morally right. In this way, if a state takes away an important right that should be protected by the state, it may be morally right for a person to rebel to force the reimposition of an important positive right. The person would need to suffer the results of participating in a legal rebellion if he fails, but there would be nothing morally wrong with challenging the state in this instance. This theory can justify, tremendously courageous acts, and it also could provide an intellectual way out of subservience to the state for those conditioned to accept state action without question. Did I kind of encapsulate your thoughts well there? Any thoughts?
Yes. I certainly that the state is subject, in my view, to natural universal moral law, and it can be judged negatively or positively in the light of that. And natural moral law may oblige the state to create rights that don't exist. It's also possible, however, that depending on circumstances, natural moral law may justify the curtailment of rights or the suspension of them. I mean, that might sound problematic, and it is dangerous, of course, but I think one has to recognize that there are certain social circumstances that justify the curtailment of rights, and I guess all the major international human rights conventions recognize that many rights in extremis may be curtailed or suspended. So for example, if you have a state that is teetering on the edge of collapse because of an insurgency, let's say, and let's assume for the sake of a simplified argument that these insurgents are bad guys. I mean, Sierra Leone, 2000, drug-crazed, diamond-hungry rebels cutting off the limbs of any civilians get in their way are approaching the state capital. So their prevailing will not be good news. And if the state collapses, no rights are secure, none, because you have gangsters in charge. So for the sake of a future where some human rights can be sustained, it may be necessary to loosen the constraints on the state's security forces, for example, to allow detention under conditions we wouldn't normally allow it. So I think, and one reason I want to avoid language of natural rights is that natural rights language implies that rights are kind of implanted in nature and have a kind of absolute unchanging character. And I want to say, well, no, actually they don't, because part of natural morality is prudence, and some circumstances will make insistence on certain rights or certain forms of rights imprudent and counterproductive. Yeah.
This discussion seems to suggest two different types of positivism. There are different names for this term, but what I call a pure positivist would reject natural morality and see law as merely an exercise in state power to achieve a desired goal. And what I would call a natural law positivist sees natural morality anchoring right action that can enable human flourishing, but looks to the state as the definer of the details of how natural morality is applied to the circumstances of the community.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think we've got two words here: positivism, which, as you say, asserts that, in a sense, the state is the highest authority. Whatever the state provides or doesn't provide in terms of right, that is positive law, as posited by the state, is the final authority. The obvious problem with that is that if that's the case, then there are no moral grounds for dissent. So I'm not a legal positivist in that sense, but I do believe in positive rights in the sense that rights are legal phenomena that human societies make or posit. So states posit them, and the positing of rights may or may not be morally justified. So we're not positivist, but we do affirm possibly morally justified positive rights.
And with the critique which Chris noted a few moments ago against that many raise against resting just with positivism, and we established clearly that you're not a pure positivist, but it seems that your theory also allows for the notion of subsidiarity to come into play for individual states, local communities, local political authorities. And you mentioned prudence. Before we end this conversation series in Trinity term, we will be discussing prudence because so far it's an important feature that I think we have to talk a little bit more about with the common good. But since a natural law positivist state needs to identify positive rights, it needs to search through the lawmakers, need to think through the circumstances of the needs of the community that they are in charge of or they're promulgating laws for. How does the notion of subsidiarity, or please feel free to expand on prudence if you'd like, play nicely into this notion that the rights are not absolutist, but might be formed in the contours worked out by individual states with positive law?
Yes, certainly I think that what rights it is prudent to grant is circumstantially dependent. And that means that certain states can afford to grant certain rights that others can't. So just to take an example, I do believe in free speech. I also believe in religious freedom. But I accept that in a society where, just for example, Indonesia, for example, or Pakistan, when during certain periods to allow Christians to proselytize is highly likely to lead to anti-Christian riots that the police can't be sure of containing. In those circumstances, lamentably, I think a curtailment of the right of free speech and religious expression is warranted. I mean, I say temporarily, I mean, ideally the state would work to a situation where that isn't necessary. But so long as it is necessary, it could be justified. But so I think what rights are granted and under what conditions, what form they take is circumstantial. And so you will get a variety of justified rights regimes across the world. And rights advocates, I think, need to be more aware of that and not to assume that what we in the wealthy West, where we enjoy, notwithstanding our quarrels and our political polarization, we enjoy a degree of political peace that has seldom been enjoyed in human history. We've seldom enjoyed our own history, and we can't take it for granted. And not every part of the world is like us. So certainly variety in the legal regimens, I agree with. The other thing to say about subsidiarity is, and this goes back to my earlier point about rights being important, rights even being important for fostering a certain beneficial common social ethos, is that rights are not enough. The law is not enough. Civil social bodies, families, religious communities, schools, voluntary associations, all have roles in fostering virtues. Now we need virtues because if we don't have a citizenry trained, let's say, to restrain themselves when they come across points of view that they dislike, trained to argue rather than to shout, then even though we have rights to free speech, if we don't have a citizenry that has been trained to be capable of respecting such a right, the right will not be so effective. And if we don't have an effective police force or effective courts, it won't be effective at all. So we do need civil social bodies to do their part. Civil social bodies don't legislate rights. The Parliament or the Congress does that. But civil social bodies have a really important part to play in creating a citizenry that is capable of respecting the rights that we have.
Well, and I think your remarks fit in nicely with a guest we had a couple of weeks ago, Asanga Welikala, who was discussing developing countries in the Commonwealth, and he was talking about how the local circumstances, the perhaps a stronger view of community, were important to reflect on in examining what they might need as laws or constitutional frameworks, rather than simply exporting a rigid notion of, as you described, what might be free speech or religious liberty. In some respects, it's a very interesting example you gave to actually respect and to protect those who could be harmed if those local circumstances aren't kept in play.
If we have time, if I could just add a footnote to that. I mean, right now, with our culture wars on both sides of the Atlantic, we have laws guaranteeing freedom of speech and expression, but it seems to me that we have a lot of people who have not been trained to respect that. I perfectly understand this is highly controversial territory, but I do see a lack of self-restraint that threatens the effectiveness of rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we've been talking about, rights, if they're not absolute, if there were absolute rights, then there likely might not be a limiting principle, which yep. could be logically problematic. So it can bounce back. It seems, just my reflection, it can bounce back in the culture of rights talk. The words yep. we use ultimately help form what we think, and they mean how they're used. So, Chris, you have.
Sure. Yeah, I have another question here. How does this notion of natural rights not existing apply in areas that the state typically does not interfere, such as parents' education of their children? If there are no natural rights, then do the children have no right to education, and do the parents have no right to educate their children?
Yes, my answer to that would be, again, let's remember there is natural morality, so we could say that children have a natural moral claim to be educated by their parents, and parents have a natural moral duty to educate them. Whether we want to give children a legal right to take their parents to court if they don't get the education they think they deserve, I rather doubt. And we could do that. It just seems to me that the risk of that is it's not going to help relationship between parents and children. It might make the state rather too interfering in the lives of families. We can't expect the state to put everything right that's wrong. And there's a danger in expecting it to do so, because then the state is required to be too intrusive, and either in order to be too intrusive, it has to become even more powerful, or it has duties to be intrusive that it just can't carry out because it doesn't have the resources. So I'd rather not talk about children having a right. I'd say they have a moral claim. However, sadly, not all parents teach their kids what they should. And maybe actually there's some things that parents can't teach the kids. I would not want to teach my kids if I had any mathematics. I'm not very good at mathematics. So we might want to say that a child has a right to an education provided by the state, or a right at least to some kind of formal schooling. That would make sense. But I, for reasons I've explained, I think we might be a bit nervous of talking about a child having a natural right to education. The other reason is that, depends what we mean by education, but you can imagine some circumstances where there simply ain't no schooling, because you're in a society where there are no schools. So you don't have a right to schooling. Do you want to say that you have a right against your parents? Well, again, it depends what you mean by a right here, but if, as I think, we have two words, we have moral claim, we have right. Do they mean the same thing? I think not. I think right means something more forceful. Well, if you have a moral right against your parents for an education in a situation where there are no schools and there is no state, who's going to enforce your right? Your child, right? So I think it's misleading to talk about a natural right to education for that reason, for those two reasons, actually.
It's perhaps a little bit off topic from education, but as you were describing that, it also reminded me a bit with children having moral claims or perhaps rights. I agree with you that moral claim is a better term. Certainly under positive law, the so-called rights of children are sometimes controversial in terms of when they might be able to emancipate themselves from their parents. There's certainly in the UK, as in the States, there's the ability for emancipation of a minor. In the UK, the courts can rescind the emancipation as well, if under certain circumstances. So it's again, it's a little bit afield from education, but it also shows, I think, how the positive law can provide a right under certain circumstances, a positive right if there is perhaps abuse, or the minor needs to somehow get away from the parent who is not performing their duties. But at the same time, it recognizes an overall social goal that if this rectifies itself, or if there's a misunderstanding at the beginning of the emancipation, it's canceled out. So it's some people will talk about emancipation as a type of right, but I don't think it's really a right. It's a mitigation of role and responsibility in society between the child and the parent, and the parent and child in society.
Yeah, Ryan, I mean, this is not something I've given a great deal of thought to, but just generally speaking, it seems to me that we can do, and my sense is we tend often to do this. We can require law and the state to sort out every kind of wrongdoing that happens in society. The problem with that is twofold. One is it requires an ever more powerful state, and that has downsides. And sometimes the state doesn't have the resources to discharge the ever increasing duties it acquires. And I just think that there may be some kinds of injustice that are best tackled by other means. That may mean that the injustices aren't always tackled, but then not even the law tackles all the injustices that need tackling. So I just think we need to be careful about thinking that rights, the creation of rights, is the way to solve the problem. I think it's often not, and that in itself can create problems of its own. That's a general comment about the multiplication of rights to solve relationship problems.
Right. But well, and along those lines, if we could turn to a topic which has come up regularly in our conversation series, and I have to say, I've been delighted that it's come up, but I was a bit surprised that it's come up so frequently, and that's the question of property. And in your book, you weave in and out a bit and discussion of rights talk of property, and to the extent this has been a sub-theme that's arisen in our conversation series. One guest we had a couple of weeks ago, we explored Aquinas's notion of property, which comes from question 66 of the Secunda Secundae. And in that, Aquinas asserts that at natural law, property is common, but that positive law rightly allows private property and gives certain positive private property rights or claims, principally so that property can be used for the common good, and that in the sense that we would have private property rights so that individuals could use it for the common good. There could be some practical and pragmatic reasons to give these private rights to it, but ultimately it needs to be used for the common good. And if natural law is at base, seeing it as common, with a big presumption on whether to overcome those private property rights, society, state can set aside some of those rights in order to use the property for the common good. So could you talk a little bit about how that might play in?
Yes. So obviously, I don't believe in a natural right to property, because I don't believe in a natural right to anything. But I'm with Aristotle, and therefore with Thomas Aquinas on this, that I think that private property does command moral justification for a variety of reasons. Thomas and Aquinas, for example, make the point that people do tend to take better care of their own things than stuff that is in common. What's more, I think good fences do make good neighbors. Having it clear who's responsible for managing, disposing of what, reduces random and dangerous friction. So there are pragmatic reasons why legal rights to property are morally justified. Prudence justifies them. However, I'm also with Aquinas in supposing that nevertheless, within the legal right, we are subject to moral obligations to exercise our legal right to dispose of our property in a manner that serves certainly our needs, the needs of our families, but also the needs of everyone. So Thomas, one point rather radically suggests that in a case where I am enjoying a surplus of property and you are destitute and desperate, and I fail to give of my surplus to supply your need, he says you have, he doesn't say you have a right to take what I have, but he does say that it would be morally right or permissible for you to take what you need from what I have. But the first point to note there is that here we have a moral obligation that is not, as it were, produced by a right, but that, as it were, governs the right holder. And in one of the problems of the rights talk is that kind of obligation, that kind of duty often gets overlooked. So that's one point there. So I do believe in property, legal rights to property, but those are subject to moral obligations to exercise that right well. And I mean, to obviously to have a state in a case where the rich are not supporting the poor out of their surplus as they should, to have a state suspend property rights is dangerous. We don't want to have that happen too often again, because an overweening state can be a major problem. But one example I use here is the case of the Irish famine in the 1840s, where the British government wanted as a rule to rely upon normal poor law provision, where local landowners were responsible for looking after their poor. The problem was that Irish landowners either wouldn't or couldn't. But in the case of those who wouldn't, should the state have intervened and seized their property? In that time and place, that's probably impossible. I don't think the state probably had the power to do it, but it's a dangerous thing to do. But in principle, in extremis, there could be moral reasons for overriding property rights, but you don't want to do it without a very strong reason, and you probably don't want to do it too often.
Right, and if you do it, you might have to suffer the consequences of the state.
And you might have to suffer the consequences.
You have a moral claim.
Yep.
Yeah, and I personally, I think that Thomas's discussion of property ends up being very key as we explore the common good, because, as you mentioned, he does describe the question of superabundance or excessive wealth. And perhaps I should start by reminding the students that are listening in that he starts by talking about theft and robbery and asking questions about theft and robbery, and then he backs into the notion of property, because he's trying to identify possession and the morality of holding or taking inappropriately, and so forth. But one of the points here I think about this, particularly with the superabundance, is what you noted, is that he's not necessarily talking about a right to it. I think there's a and he is coming along in intellectual history just a bit before rights, as we might think of them as natural rights, start to really come into some of the language. So he's not talking to, he doesn't talk so much about a natural right to this or that. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there is that the property being from a natural morality perspective being needed to be used for the common good, when it is not needed to be, when it's not being used for the common good and someone is in need of it, though the state might have all sorts of rules and laws and penalties, that it's a good example where there may be a moral claim and the person may be morally right to take care of his family and so forth, to do things which may have consequences.
Yep.
That he has to suffer.
Yep.
Would you say that justice overrides rights?
Okay, I think of justice as an all things considered state of affairs. So I'm an ethicist, not a lawyer. So justice is circumstantially dependent. And it involves a whole set of different considerations. Yeah, so just going back to the case we were talking about there. So So if you have a case where the rich are permitting the poor to starve, then dangerous though it might be as a precedent, certainly dangerous as it would be as a habit, natural morality would determine that justice obliges the state to override legal rights to property. In this case, for the sake of the relief of the poor with the resources that other people can amply afford to give, but haven't. So I think justice is a larger entity, and whether or not rights should be granted or respected is subject to judgments about justice. But you make the judgment of justice about justice in the light of, or by the means that natural morality with its principles, its duties, its virtues, its understanding of common goods, in those terms, you make a judgment about justice, and the standing or falling of rights depends on that, or is subject to it.
We have time for a couple more questions before we turn to some that are come in through the chat box. A question recently that we've been asking our guests, and we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, is something that has come up as we've been doing this course, and that is because people are listening in outside of the university and watching the videos on YouTube. We've had some interesting reactions to the term common good, very, very different reactions. And I'm going to overgeneralize that the reactions have often been different by geography. And I'm going to suspect that perhaps reactions to your book, What's Wrong with Rights, has also been a bit different by geography as well. So with the common good, there's quite a bit of interest in the common good in Europe, on the continent, and in the UK, and in Ireland. The term flows in the language. In the States, the reaction has been very different. People bristle often at the term the common good. So for some people, it brings to mind domination of the state, or collectivism, or a segment of broader society that might dominate over others. So I just, ironically, what we've been discussing throughout the conversation series is quite the opposite, that though vague, the notion of the common good flows back for individual human flourishing, at least in a classical legal theory sense, and in the context of Thomas. I'm just curious, with those comments, have you seen a divide in reactions to your book on rights?
It's early days yet, so I've yet to see the full array of reactions. But I mean, you are correct, and I speak as a Briton married to an American who spent 7 years in North America. Certainly, your typical American, compared to your typical Briton, has a suspicion of the state that the typical Briton doesn't quite have. And the reasons, of course, are partly a result of our different histories. So if you're a homesteader in the Western Plains, you're accustomed to looking after yourself, and besides, you did rebel against King George, so you may not like state interference so much. Whereas we here in Britain, we grew the biggest state during World War II. The state saved us. So to some extent, different histories predispose different peoples in different ways toward the state. But nevertheless, we in Britain are pretty fond of our liberties, and I agree with if we're thinking of the common good in that kind of, as a kind of, as you put it, collectivist aggregate, though it's quite hard to figure out what on earth that would be, but if those are the terms at which we're thinking it, which the state imposes, then you'll not find many Britons very keen on that at all, I'm glad to say, and I certainly wouldn't be. But as I suggested by an example I gave earlier, the state is quite important in providing certain basic goods, and if you are the beleaguered homesteader under attack from gangsters, then you probably will welcome the 7th Cavalry. But without the federal state, there ain't no cavalry. so you know, too much state is a problem. But we in the comfortable, peaceful, free West need to remember that too little of a state can be a disaster. And we can look at Yugoslavia when it collapsed in the 1990s. We can look at Rwanda. We can look at other failed states, and that's where thugs rule. So too little state is also a problem. It's not one we've suffered from recently. We did suffer from it before, so you're quite right about the, as it were, the different geographical prejudices. But I think in terms of a kind of totalitarian, collectivist, aggregate notion of common good, most people on both sides of the Atlantic would be shy of that. But perhaps those of us on this side of the Atlantic are more appreciative of the fact that the state is actually necessary for certain very important common goods that we depend on.
And with that, I wish we had more time, but perhaps a final wrap up or roll up question, which is on my mind, and then I think it perhaps goes a bit with Chris can read one of the important questions in the chat, is that you discuss Burke in your book and the notion of the contingency of rights. And well, for the sake of time, I'll just roll that into the question, which is okay. Sort of the conflict. We have a question that came in on the conflicting public opinions in society in looking at relativism, which I think can be sort of a thin theory, but in popular culture takes hold. And with the notion of a contingency of rights, and all the debates about how to manage the different views of what might constitute the correct right, positive right, or what constitutes the common good. What would be your reaction to all of that rolled together? I thought that's probably quite a bit of a mesh.
Yeah, let me just comment on this notion of the contingency of rights. I mean, I do think that there are some legal rights that all societies should grant, and a right against torture is one. And if people want to know why I think that, I discuss it in chapter 7 of the book, I think. So not all rights are contingent. I think there are some rights that every society should grant, and there may be more than just torture. I'm open to that in principle. But that said, I think that as I've explained, I think in certain circumstances of the state being on the verge of collapse, or in extreme circumstances of war, the suspension, temporary, under legal supervision of rights can be justified. The most striking example I give in the book is set in Rwanda in the 1990s, early noughties. So there, and this has to do with the right to a fair trial. And in Rwanda, in turn of the millennium, they had, I think, 120,000 people accused of genocide in prisons, designed for 12,000. As a result, many prisoners were dying. But they were in a situation where most of their lawyers and judges had either been slaughtered or fled. And they were finding that trying to try all these cases according to procedures normal in wealthy Western countries. Someone estimated that it would take about 200 years to process them. So what are they to do? Well, what they did do was to relax some of the rules. And one of the rules they relaxed was defendants, at least not the most, not those accused of the most grave crimes, but those at a lower level were dealt with by revived, modified, traditional village courts. And in those processes, defendants were not given legal counsel. And now they were given, there were other safeguards against false conviction, wrong conviction, but not the safeguard of access to legal counsel, partly because they wanted the process to be a reconciling one as well as an adversarial one, not an adversarial one. But human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and International, were insistent that they had to have without legal counsel, there was no fair trial, and accused the Iranian government of violating their commitment to, or failing to live up to their commitment to maintain human rights. And my reaction to that is, well, you know, it's no good demanding of a government that it uphold a right to a fair trial as we're accustomed to it when it does not have the means to do so. It's no good. And in fact, if you keep on insisting, what happens is that the politicians start getting a deaf ear. They don't listen anymore because they're fed up with being lectured by people who will not accept the circumstances. And it seemed to me, therefore, perfectly reasonable that the Rwandan government took the steps it did, even though there was a greater risk, an unavoidably greater risk of wrong conviction. But that's one example I give of where I think prudence, which is a moral virtue, requires at least the modification of rights, sometimes even their suspension. Because all things considered, justice is best served by the suspension or the modification of a right. And that goes back to Chris's earlier question about justice and rights.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel, for joining us today. And we are very happy that you were able to have a conversation with us about this topic. I appreciate you staying on a few minutes extra. I can't leave without asking you a bit about your background, because it's a beautiful picture, and I hope that wherever you took it, you were engaged in human flourishing.
Yes, well, I'm so proud of this, what this picture depicts, that I have it as my background. And in case you were wondering, no, it's not Oxford. This betrays my fascination with military history. Very briefly, in April 1944, Cretan partisans, this is Crete, with two British officers, one who became famous after the war as a travel writer, Patrick Leigh Fermor, kidnapped the second in command of the German garrison and marched him across the mountains of Crete to the south coast onto a British boat and off to Cairo. The escapade was made famous by a book and then a film called Ill Met by Moonlight. So in 2015 and 2017, I and one peer of mine and two younger friends, we followed the route they took over the mountains. And here we are in 2015, coming around the eastern shoulder of Mount Ida, birthplace of Zeus. And that's the panorama that opened out in front of us. The sea beyond that is the Mediterranean. And if there is land beyond that, it's North Africa. But I would recommend Crete in May, early May, not too hot, flowers are beautiful, and the sky is blue.
And I do believe they are, they're lobbying heavily to make sure that summer tourism is there.
I bet they are. And you know, if you feel desperate for a summer holiday after lockdown, then fly to Crete. I recommend it.
Wonderful. Well, Professor Biggar, thank you so much. We appreciate it, and we hope we can continue the discussion, hopefully live in Michaelmas and next academic year.
I look forward to that, and thanks very much for a fascinating conversation. I have welcomed the opportunity.
Thank you.